Good morning, Mr. Wright.
Good morning, my lady. Can I check that you can both see and hear us in the hearing room?
I can, thank you.
Thank you very much. Then I call Mark Cheeseman.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Thank you, Mr. Cheeseman. You are, as I understand it, the Chief Executive Officer of the Public Sector Fraud Authority. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And you've provided a statement to the inquiry, which is reference INQ 000657728. Before I ask you questions arising from that statement, it's also right, Mr. Cheeseman, that you have signed a statement dated the 9th of December, which supplements your earlier statement, making a number of corrections. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
My lady, rather than reading those into the record, because there are a number, could I instead have permission to publish that supplementary statement in due course?
Certainly, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Cheeseman, can we just understand, first of all, what is the Public Sector Fraud Authority that you lead?
So the Public Sector Fraud Authority was created in August 2022. It's a centre of expertise that sits at the heart of government as part of Cabinet Office and working very closely with Treasury. And it works with government departments and public bodies to better understand and reduce the impact of fraud against the public sector.
And did the establishment of the Public Sector Fraud Authority to some extent come about as a response to fraud seen during the COVID pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. It was established in response to the lessons learned from fraud during the pandemic. Yeah.
And that is because, as we understand it from your statement, there were estimated to be at least £13 billion of fraud and financial loss associated with COVID-19 related initiatives. Is that right?
So just to clarify the number from the statement, so the level in the statement is 10.48 billion, and that's a level because some of the fraud in the pandemic was from bounce back loans, and some of those will be paid back. One thing I would highlight from my role is that level will have elements of doubt around it, but that's the best estimate we have.
Okay, thank you. Now, before you were appointed to lead this new organisation, you previously had experience in fraud in government, is that right? Prior to that?
Yes, absolutely. So I worked in the Legal Aid Agency as the head of their fraud unit. And then since 2013, I've been working in the Cabinet Office looking at fraud across the whole of government.
Yeah. And so far as organisations that are relevant to the pandemic period itself, in April of 2020, is it right, you were promoted to be Director of the Centre of Expertise and Chief Operating Officer of the Fraud, Error, Debt and Grants Business Unit?
Yes, so I just returned from Australia where I've been working with them to set up a centre looking at fraud across government. And I became the director for the counter-fraud function and the chief operating officer of Fraud, Error, Debt and Grants, which was a larger business unit that team was in.
Yeah. And so during the pandemic, that was the predecessor of the organisation you're now leading, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And was it, generally speaking, performing a similar function?
The Public Sector Fraud Authority does broader functions, so it has a more explicit role in holding departments and public bodies to account, so agreeing targets with them on what they're doing on fraud and how they're managing it. But the themes were similar. How do we do more to find and fight fraud against the public sector?
Yeah. Now, sitting in the government's counter-fraud function at the time of the pandemic was something called the Centre of Expertise. Is that right?
So, yes, so the government counter-fraud function is the part across the whole of government, so everyone working on that area. So, for instance, in the finance function, everyone working on finance in government is part of the function. Those functions then have a centre, which is a small team somewhere located in government. So the Centre of Expertise was the small team. It was about 40 people in Cabinet Office, which was the centre of that broader function.
And what was the real purpose of having that central team, the Centre of Expertise? What was it there to do that would be relevant to the actions of departments during the pandemic?
So it did a number of things, and what it did was traditionally how people had worked on fraud across public bodies, and this is the same across the world, is that individual organisations work out how they're going to deal with fraud. What it did is it brought together all that expertise and it set standards for how you could work on fraud together. So where was the best or the optimal activity happening, and how could that be a standard? So they had a functional standard, which was introduced in 2018, as I think it says in my statement. And then it also brought people together to agree standards for the people. So not just the organisations, but the people, which was the counter-fraud profession. Again, that was very new. That had only been introduced in 2018 and was still, and is still growing, and standards are still being set.
Yeah. And in the context of tackling fraud, is it important to think about measures you can take prospectively? So when you're standing up a scheme, things you can do to mitigate fraud and error at the outset, and also to look at what you can then do once something is established to conduct what you term post-event assurance in relation to schemes that have been established. So to see how, in fact, they are operating and to identify levels of fraud and error.
So absolutely correct. So it is optimal to try and prevent as much fraud as you can by putting in the best controls you can. However, that can be difficult because you're speculating what will happen, not rather than what you do see. So optimally we do that, but also then some fraud always will happen. Some will get through. We have a very capable and committed adversary who is looking to defraud both us as individuals, but also the public sector in my case. So then how you react to it after is very important as well. And if it's all right, there was one thing from your previous question I didn't mention. I talked about the standards, but I didn't talk about the data analytics services we are also starting to run, so bringing data from across government together to help public bodies to find fraud. And I should have mentioned that. Apologies.
Okay. So in the course of the pandemic, was the Centre of Expertise there to assist departments, if asked to do so, in terms of how they might think about mitigating the risks of fraud and error with things they were looking to do, but also to assist departments in terms of how they conducted that post-event assurance, how they monitored and evaluated schemes that they'd established?
So the Centre of Expertise in the pandemic did a few things. It built awareness of scams. So we had an intelligence team that did that. So public scams. So for instance, vaccine, some of the vaccine fraud that was happening, and trying to put messages out to the public around that. As you say, it worked with departments, and it did that through direct advice, but it also did that through putting out guidance. So again, a way a centre of a function works, bring all the best practice together and then put it out there so people can get it easily. So it put out guidance in a number of areas, including post-event assurance, as you've mentioned in your question. We did work to understand the risks. So we had something called the Global Fraud Risk Assessment. One of the challenges of the pandemic is it hit all of government at the same time. There were hundreds of schemes. There were over 70 schemes for businesses and 70 schemes for individuals. So we tried to hold a view of all of those schemes. What do we know about the risk and where are the highest risks? And then, as you say, we helped departments with advice on how to do post-event assurance.
Just want to pick up on post-event assurance for a moment or two, if we can. Someone critically might say, well, that's just closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. That's just working out what you've lost. It's not actually doing anything to stop you losing it. Would that be an unfair way of looking at post-event assurance?
I not wanting to use. I think it's an unbalanced way. I think there always is some that will come in. So I think there's always a role for post-event assurance. And that's in normal times as well as other times, because fraudsters adapt what they're doing. They adapt how they're attacking systems. So it's helpful to always do post-event activity.
Pausing there, and I don't want to cut you off, but just developing that. So, yes, you're looking backwards, but you're not just looking backwards to work out what the numbers are. You're looking backwards to work out how were people able to defeat the measures that we put in place, and how going forwards can we close those gaps. Is that right?
You're looking backwards to find that out. You're looking backwards in some cases to measure, because measurement is quite expensive. So you're, in some high-risk cases, you're looking to measure. You're also looking back and doing post-event assurance to find stuff. Fraud is a hidden crime, so you have to look for it. So you're looking back to find stuff, so then you can take action not just on improving the system, but also on getting money back and taking action where incorrect payments with their fraud have been made. There's one more thing I'll quickly say, if that's okay, and I think the International Public Sector Fraud Forum in February 2020 released guidance on managing fraud in emergency circumstances. That the reality of an emergency environment is you have to act quicker. You have to act quickly to deal with things. And that guidance, which was built by us alongside international partners in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, that says in those times you may have to accept more upfront risk. In fact, you're going to have to. So therefore, it's important to do post-event activity to do that. So I don't think it's shutting the doors, the stable after you use the metaphor. I don't think it's that in the pandemic. I think it's following the guidance and following the practices.
Yeah. And so because the pandemic called for swift action, it became even more important, really.
Yes. Yeah, and the guidance, yes.
Yes. We understand that a post-event assurance board was established in March 2020 and that you chaired that. And what was the function of that board?
So the post-event assurance, another piece of context which I hope is helpful is that fraud measurement and post-event assurance activity and fraud as a discipline is comparatively new. That's why the government took the step to build these standards. So the purpose of the board was, one, to provide guidance and oversee what was going on post-event assurance. It was also to bring together expertise from lots of different parts of government to try and work out the best way to do it. So in the terms of reference for the board, we see it has the counter-fraud function in it, but it also has the analysis function, the commercial function, the grants function, the finance function, the internal audit function. So they were there to shape the internal audit programme. They were then there as well to review the plans that were created by departments on how they were going to do post-event assurance activity. And then they advised the Fraud Ministerial Board on those plans and whether they were in line with what they felt they should be doing.
Yeah. Can you just explain to us from your standpoint why it is that the risk of fraud tends to rise during emergency situations such as the pandemic?
I think there's two factors I'd point to. One is, in an emergency situation, you have to act quicker. More quickly, sorry. So when you have to act more quickly, you don't have as much time to consider all the controls you could put in place or build the structures for those controls. So to build a fraud management system takes some time to build. If you have to act straight away, you can't build before you do it, right? So that time element is one. I think there's also another important element, which is the vulnerability of the people involved in that emergency. And the pressing priority in that is to get the support, whatever that is in whatever emergency it is, the support to those who are vulnerable. The frustrating thing is that opens the doors for fraudsters to pretend to be those people or to hide themselves to then try and get access to that support or funding or whatever it is that the government is trying to do to support in an emergency.
Okay. And generally, is that well understood in the fraud prevention world that emergencies lead to those opportunities for fraudsters, if that's the right way of describing them?
I would say generally yes, but I would highlight that the 2020 guidance produced by the International Public Sector Fraud Forum was the first of its type, and that's why we did it.
Yeah.
So, whilst if you had a conversation about it, generally yes, is there a textbook which explains it all? Less so.
No. So the generally yes. I mean, I suppose it might depend on who you are. If you're a anti-fraud specialist, then you probably would know that. But looking back at 2020, did you think that this was well enough understood across all of government that these risks were going to grow?
I mean, certainly we communicated information on it, and from the evidence that's been provided for me to look at here, I can see that it is not, people are not unaware of it. So I'd say there was some awareness, yes.
Yeah. And did you view it as your role to promote that awareness?
Yes.
Right. And was it necessary to restructure at all the Centre of Expertise in response to the pandemic? And if so, in what ways did you do that?
Yes, absolutely. So it was. We had to a lot of the work was a lot of the things we were doing before were longer term structures being built. Things like standards, things like the profession, and reviewing against those standards. We shifted to a much more operational, how do we have an impact now, rather than build the structures for the future type unit at that point. So we deprioritised work on the functional standards. We deprioritised a lot of the work we were doing to build capability in the system and took resources from that alongside other resources to build an intelligence team that was sharing intelligence between public bodies. That was referenced in Module 5 and the work it did with PPE. We built a countermeasures team, which was providing guidance on countermeasures and how those could be used.
Just explain those countermeasures, what they are, what you mean.
Yes, okay, yes, yeah. We always use different words. Controls, basically. So fraudsters are going to attack the system. How do you defend? What are the range of options? The answer is there are a very, very broad range of options, and it depends on the risk. So sharing guidance on what you can do to counter the threat and the risk from those committing fraud. We provided other things like a minimum data specification. Sounds a bit boring, but it's actually quite important for post-event assurance, because then it means all the data you've collected can be matched against each other and has common data pieces and is held in the same way. We did some data analytics work especially with bounce back loans, pushed our teams into doing that, and with the COVID grants, helping them to find fraud both in and after. We also then had the piece I've talked about already, which was the risk and research team. So you said about part of my role to be to tell the system this is an issue, well, to build the evidence on that, to have the global fraud risk assessment, doing that and sharing that with people. And we also did work in there to support departments to do their own fraud risk assessments and help them with that.
Yeah. So those are all things you had to pivot into and set up relatively quickly. Did you think or find that you were, generally speaking, well enough resourced at the time to do all of that and to do it as well as you wanted to?
So it wasn't my decision to how much resource we should have. We put in a case and that's what we got. I would highlight at the time that resources were tight. And certainly, as my evidence says, we were asked to put in the lowest case for the maximum impact. So that's what we put in.
And if you compared and contrast what the resource you had available in 2020 and the capability you had in 2020, and then you looked at what you now have in the Public Sector Fraud Authority, how comparable are they?
They're designed to do slightly different things, but the Public Sector Fraud Authority is bigger, has more budget and resource to do it, and is built off the lessons. So also the comparison has a journey on it, which was trying to develop from our experiences. Yeah.
So if those teams that you mentioned, the risk and research team, the countermeasures team, the intelligence team, all had to be stood up at short notice in 2020, going forwards, do those sorts of teams exist on a standing basis?
Yes. All three of those teams in some format exist, or it would only need a slight tweak to our structure currently to develop one of those. We'd have to do a bit more work into guidance on the countermeasures side, so a slight tweak.
And so should that be viewed as a structural change that has come about as a result of the learning from the pandemic?
I'd say the Public Sector Fraud Authority as a whole is a structural change that's come about as a result of the experiences of the pandemic, yes.
Yeah, okay. And I think on the 17th of March of 2020, you sent an email to counter-fraud leaders in a number of other government departments and agencies. So the Home Office, National Crime Agency, Serious Fraud Office, HMRC, DWP and City of London Police. I'm just going to ask if that can be put up, please. INQ, there we are, 000 594 189. And we see there, third paragraph, this is an email from you. I'm now reaching out to you in terms of how we come together to help the government effectively deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, the government's main priority. And then on page 2, what the situation, there we are, is asking for is that somewhere in government there is an understanding of the total picture on fraud and economic crime in this crisis, so it can be called upon either to give confidence or to make clear the problems. If we are agreed, I'm keen that we or some of your key personnel form a pseudo board where we share the picture as it develops, including things like evolving scams to the public, and new areas of public spending at risk, and the action we are taking together to deal with it. Thank you all. I look forward to hearing from you. Now, just breaking down some parts of that email, we should understand, should we, that lots of other departments and organisations had their own well-established counter-fraud teams and capability, and these were the people you were reaching out to.
So there's two groups I'm reaching out to here, and they are the areas who do the most work on fraud. So one group is HMRC and DWP, who had 84% of the resources and working on fraud in tax and welfare. The other is the Serious Fraud Office, the City of London Police, National Crime Agency, who look at the fraud threat against the public. So I am reaching out to the whole community. Generally, historically, we'd kind of focused on fraud against the public sector, and the Home Office and others had focused on fraud against the public. And I was reaching out to that whole community to try and bring us together right at the start of the pandemic, and they responded to it.
So this was you trying to bring together all of that expertise, all of that learning in one place, and as you say, across government. So there could be one picture really across government of what was going on and learning shared. Is that the point?
100%, and one voice. And then when you look at the GPS MIG, apologies, I've now forgotten what that stands for, but the ministerial board we put a paper to, that was from that combined, one voice of the view of the situation across the picture.
And was this you, Mr. Cheeseman, taking your own initiative, or was this you being tasked to try and bring together that cross-government approach?
This was my initiative.
Right. And how effective was it, this call to arms, if you like?
Very, very good. Very effective. Everyone came. You'll see one of the things I said, was that I'm not precious about who does what. I think I said in the email words along those lines. Everyone came in, everyone collaborated. We shared a lot of information. It built, for instance, the intelligence team, it built the links from the police and their intelligence coming into the public sector, so that could be used to try and help. So it was very effective, yeah. And it led to the advice that went to the GPS MIG as well. Yeah. And it continued to meet in various forms throughout the pandemic, as it says in my evidence.
Yeah. And looking now at the Public Sector Fraud Authority, is the PSFA now doing that cross-government work that you were calling for there? Do the two things, one inform the other?
So I think, so that was calling, because we're in a crisis, to bring together the public element of it, so we could put guidance out to the public as well, and we could link all of that, and the fraud against the public sector part of it. The Public Sector Fraud Authority focuses on fraud in the public sector. We collaborate closely with those other sides still, but the Public Sector Fraud Authority has not taken on responsibility for fraud against businesses or fraud against the public, which the NCA and City of London Police and the Home Office have.
So this was actually going wider.
Yes.
Okay, understood. Can we move on, please, just to discuss the COVID-19 Fraud Ministerial Board? And
Yes.
could you just speak to that board, what it was and how it was established?
So I've talked about the GPS MIG, which was I think a cabinet subcommittee that was looking at how to deal with things in COVID-19.
To give it a name, as
Sorry.
we understand it. No, don't worry. I wouldn't have had the first idea if it wasn't written down in front of me.
Thank
The
you.
General Public Sector Ministerial Implementation Group is the GPS MIG.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Apologies, I didn't
We'll
have
call it the
full-
GPS MIG from now on, shall we?
Very much
All right.
appreciated. So from that collaboration with the pseudo board, going to the GPS MIG with a paper that the Home Office was agreed on, the National Crime Agency was agreed, we came together for that. That said, here are some of the areas we should focus. And those areas we should focus were doing post-event assurance, which we've already touched on, investing in doing more on intelligence, which I've touched on a bit about what we did with partners in the other parts, exploring legislation, and then doing a lessons learned exercise. And the Fraud Ministerial Board was set up as a ministerial group to oversee the implementation of that and to be the governance that oversaw how that commission from the GPS MIG was taken forward.
And were you really advocating that this should be centralised, brought together under the authority of the Cabinet Office as a cross-government forum?
So the Fraud Ministerial Board was chaired by both the Cabinet Office and the Home Office. So the minister responsible for fraud as a whole and the minister responsible for public fraud against the public sector.
Was there any tension that you saw or identified between that centralised board and the role of individual departments in tackling fraud within their own department?
Yes, absolutely. And there was. So historically, certainly I know Bays, for instance, and it's in the evidence, Bays were nervous about how the centre of government overseeing work on this interacted with accounting officer responsibility. And generally, accounting officers are accountable to Parliament for how they deal with public money, the money that they've got, and how they do that. Now, I would say, in my personal view, generally, from time to time, government thinks about how the centre of the government focuses on delivery in key areas, so implementation groups and pieces like that. And the functions was one of those. The functional areas, having different functions, was an area where it said, well, actually, the centre of government may ask more and may monitor more closely what's going in certain areas. But that does have a slight tension with accounting officer responsibility as it's set out. So there was tension on that, and whether we should have a role in overseeing what departments were doing and asking them to submit reports to us. And as I said, the evidence said Bays certainly had that tension.
So there was a sense in which some departments, and you mentioned Bays, were of the view, well, we have an accounting officer who is responsible to Parliament for making sure we spend money sensibly and that we do what we can to bear down on fraud. So we don't need another body effectively overseeing what we are doing. Is that the position?
Yes, and that is how the accounting officer structure is how government is set up.
Yeah. So it was an obvious potential tension.
Yes.
But you presumably, this body wasn't being set up so much as to snoop on accounting officers, but as to ensure that best practice was being applied across government. Is that right?
Well, so I think, and I say this in some of the emails and the evidence, I think we had a dual role, which was both to support, but also to look at the areas where there were challenges and put challenge into the system.
Yeah. And just picking that up, putting challenge into the system, in the context of anti-fraud measures and post-event assurance, how important is challenge, internal challenge and external challenge?
I feel it's quite important. I mean, traditionally, an organisation, an audit and risk committee would do some of that challenge. Personally, as a fraud expert, I think how fraud is dealt with is quite a specialised area, and it can be a bit counterintuitive. It's a hidden crime, so you've got to look for it and finding it, and actually finding it is a good thing because it means you can act on it. So I think that challenge from an informed consumer is an important part of a healthy system looking to deal with fraud.
So an internal or external voice challenging what you're doing is going to, generally speaking, make people bear down harder on the problem.
Yes, and I think you'd see that in a number of, it doesn't just have to be fraud, you'd see that in a number of different areas.
And now, looking now at how things are configured with the Public Sector Fraud Authority, within government, within public spending, does your organisation work as that challenge? Is that part of your function to challenge or not?
Yes, and it's explicit in our mandate that that is part of our function. So one of the things we do is we agree targets, outcome-based targets with departments and challenge them whether they're going far enough. Another thing we do, I talked about the functional standards previously, but we review how functional standards are being done and whether the functional standards are being met. And it's recognised that's part of our challenge. We do the same with fraud risk assessments and other elements. So yes, it's an inherent part, and it's actively recognised in our mandate that that's what the Public Sector Fraud Authority is there to do, as well as provide support.
I'm being asked, Mr. Cheeseman, to ask you to slow down a little bit. My fault. So it's just so that the stenographer can keep up. So it's part of your mandate now that you provide that challenge. Does that mean that there doesn't also need to be internal challenge in each of the departments that you are externally providing that challenge for?
Yes, there should be. I'd expect there to be internal challenge as well. One of the things in the previous anti-corruption strategy was having a fraud lead in a department who would be part of that challenge and support. You have that expert voice. I'd also expect challenge from an audit and risk committee on what's going on fraud. So there should be internal and external challenge, I would say.
And do I take it from your answer that you would generally support the proposition it should be an identified person or persons who have responsibility for leading that challenge, or not?
Yes, and our functional standard, would outline that. So yes, I think yes, certainly a function, yes, personal person.
And I think you provided a briefing, the government counter-fraud function provided a briefing to Lord Agnew on the 17th of June of 2020. I'm just moving on now to what were identified in the pandemic as some key areas of fraud risk. So if we could have INQ 000477258. Yeah. Can you just remind us what Lord Agnew was, what his function was at the time?
Of course, yes. So Lord Agnew was a minister. He was a joint Treasury and Cabinet Office minister, and he had quite a wide portfolio. But as part of his portfolio, he looked at the management of fraud, error, debt, and grants, and within that was the public sector fraud and fraud against the public sector agenda.
Okay, so this is a briefing from the government counter-fraud function that you're leading to Lord Agnew, 17th of June, and you say there we've identified key fraud risk areas are below, and then there's further detail, but let's just look at the list. So universal credit, which sat within the Department of Work and Pensions, the job retention scheme that was sitting within His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, PPE and medical supplies, Department of Health and Social Care and the NHS, business support grants, BEIS, bounce back loans, BEIS and the British Business Bank, and then test and trace. So those were areas that were the sort of the most obvious areas that were identified?
Yeah, so this was driven from the Global Fraud Risk Assessment, which I mentioned earlier. So these were the ones that have been identified as having the highest risk from that process. of significant loss from fraud and error.
Yeah. And we can see there, can't we, that these are sitting across a number of different departments and organisations, and that perhaps identifies why it was important from your perspective to have an organisation at the centre that was providing advice across all of those different organisations and departments. Is that right?
Yes, as I said, the challenge hit government as a whole, so the breadth of it was wide, and I think that made it advantageous that we had this cross-system view.
But if we look at those departments and how well equipped they were at the start of the pandemic themselves to deal with fraud, would you agree that it was variable and very often related to what their function was in ordinary times?
Yes.
Sorry. Sorry, answer my question.
Yes.
I started wandering off into another one before I'd let you answer the first one. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah. And just building on that then, so if you look at universal credit and the job retention scheme, which sit as numbers 1 and 2, Department of Work and Pensions and HMRC, in ordinary times, I think you said earlier, was it 84% of government's anti-fraud employees work in those departments? So
that's correct.
In ordinary times, are they pretty well versed to dealing with fraud and error?
Yes, and they're on a different order to many of the other public bodies because they have large compliance units, large investigation units, data and analytics work. They're constantly testing and evolving how they're dealing with fraud on a big scale. And actually, this list evolves as the pandemic goes on, and we were assured by the activity they were doing and the capability they had. So, for instance, they were already looking to do post-event assurance activity to measure it.
Yeah. And if we look in contrast at Bays, who had responsibility for significant, or accounting officer responsibility for significant schemes like business support grants and bounce back loans, in contrast, pre-pandemic, did they have minimal capability internally in terms of tackling fraud and error?
Yes, as it says in the statement, they had a small policy team of two full-time equivalents, which was undertaking a very different role to those big units in the two departments we talked about before.
But to be fair to Bays in this example, that's a reflection, isn't it, of what they do in ordinary times, in that they were a policy department rather than an operational department, if you like, in the same way that HMRC or the DWP are.
They had a different role. They were not delivering universal credit and other benefits, and they were not managing the tax system. So they were not doing a big operational role like those two are absolutely huge operational roles, yes.
But in ordinary times, they also weren't providing loan schemes and grant schemes. Not on this scale, anyway.
Not on this scale.
No. And so this was about you, identifying departments that needed more help as much as anything else?
This was about identifying where the biggest risks were. So where the biggest risks were, where we might want to put the most attention. And then, yes, that interplay then with capability then interacted with where the most effort or resources went into helping individual departments.
Can we look at some of the individual types of support there and just drill down a little one by one as to why they were identified as being potentially high-risk schemes against the Global Fraud Risk Assessment? And let's start with business support grants. What were the concerns there from your perspective?
So, again, we've talked previously about the pace and the need to act. So the pace of the payments going out, that they were push payments. There was also a challenge that they were being administered through local authorities. And I was aware, as someone in the industry, as were other colleagues at the centre, that how local authorities deal with fraud is variable, in the same way that how government departments deal with fraud is variable. So as such, that would lead to risk, because some organisations may operate different processes with different controls. The other thing I didn't touch on it earlier, but why fraud goes up in emergency circumstances is because fraudsters know it's an emergency circumstance. They know the money's coming out, and they're not going to be idle at that point.
No, as you said, you're dealing with an adversary who is waiting for an opportunity to exploit potential weakness.
And is capable.
Yeah. And so, were you, the Centre of Excellence, allocating resources to try and support BEIS and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government who are delivering those schemes?
Absolutely, yes. We were. I was giving some advice myself. I think that's in the evidence. Also, we had what we called a Scrum Squad, which was some expertise we put in to help them understand the risk and help them explore what countermeasures. They had the countermeasures toolkit and the other guidance we had provided as well. We also, with them, did direct data analytics work. So the National Fraud Initiative, that's a scheme which draws data from lots of local authorities and other public bodies and other organisations. We added that grants data to the mandatory data collection that they bring in. So that could be run to look for instances of fraud, and that detected £2.1 million worth of fraud. We had a system called Spotlight, which brought together data from companies, house and other areas to help look up front. And we also had created a couple of tools, one called Bank Account Verification Checker and one called the Active Company Checker, which again looked for fraud risks and were made available to local authorities to use.
Yeah. Can I just ask you about one particular thing? I think you had some concern, is that right, about league tables that the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government were asking or were publishing about local authorities and their ability to administer grants. Is that right?
Yes, I wrote to Jenny Dibden about it. There was consideration of publishing league tables on how quickly and how much of the volume of grants had gone out or the volume of money of grants had gone out. I advised against that because my view where I'm really focusing on how we reduce fraud in this environment, my view was that would increase the risk of fraud because that would act as an incentive to pay money quicker, which may lead to then not doing some checks that maybe you were going to do, but you want to be a few steps higher on that league table or you want to be at the top. So actually, let's get the money out. So because that was driving pace, as we've talked about earlier, that would increase the risk of significant fraud loss.
So far as the coronavirus job retention scheme and self-employed schemes were concerned, now these sat within HMRC and DWP, I think, or HMRC, who had this greater capability. What assistance did you offer to HMRC? Or did they need much assistance, frankly?
No, I don't think they did. We met with them as the function as well. One of the things we do is we know a lot of different spaces in government, so we can help link people up because we work across the system. So I think from the note that's in the evidence, you can see that we link them up with some other parts of government to help them collaborate with them to help them to reduce their risk. But they had a lot of capability and a lot of experts who were involved in design, and they had a clear plan for post-event assurance. So we were assured by their capability. I would also point out that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs didn't just deal with their own risks, they helped deal with others. So some of the data that was used to find fraud elsewhere was provided by them in doing that. And in fact, they helped put a check in bounce back lanes.
Okay. And similarly, so far as universal credit was concerned, it was on the list. But again, did you find that generally speaking, DWP had pretty good systems in place? They
had good capability and they demonstrated a very proactive approach. So they contacted the centre and talked about the issue. They flagged, they had to reduce the upfront checks, I'm sure we'd have touched on that elsewhere, and move resources out of fraud into another area. But they put a flag on every single claim that came through or every application that came through there, and then proactively built something to go back and look at that and find it and committed to measurement. So very proactive. So yes, that greatly assured us.
Okay. Can we move on then to the bounce back loan scheme
Absolutely.
and your involvement with that. I think you describe a substantial amount of your organisation's work being done was focused on the Bounce Back Loan Scheme. Is that right?
Yes.
And if I could just have up INQ 00610678, page 5, paragraph 1. This is a document from the Government Counter-Fraud Function describing the Bounce Back scheme as the highest risk. It is the C19 scheme with the highest residual risk of fraud. To date, over 42 billion has been paid out to over 1.4 million entities. Our estimate of losses to fraud and error is currently 5 to 10%, 2 to 4 billion, which is the figure that BEIS are currently using. Maybe obvious to you, but why was that the scheme that had the highest residual risk of fraud?
So there'd be two factors, as you've drawn on in your questions before. One would be the inherent riskiness of the scheme, which I think was recognised. And two, the capability as government that we had pointed towards it. So why was the scheme risky? Some of it's mentioned in this note here, but the 100% guarantee led to risk because of the incentives in the system for the deliverer of which was lenders to look for fraud in the system.
So just pausing there,
yeah,
putting it bluntly, they didn't have any skin in the game. They were getting the money out, but they weren't taking the risk.
The challenge for them as a business, I would say, is if you have a 100% guarantee, if you're going to look for fraud in your system, that is just cost to you. You just have to spend money to look for fraud, and commercially for you, that will make no difference at the end of the day because you'd have had the guarantee covered. So that the incentives, I would say, were wrong. I wouldn't quite use your language. But yeah.
So it's not. But it's important you clarify that. It's not just that they weren't at risk of the loss, but actually it's also that they would be losing.
They would lose money.
Money, if they stood up measures to look at fraud.
Absolutely.
Because what was the point from their purely commercial assessment of the product?
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
The second reason it was risky was self-declaration. So any self-declaration scheme is inherently risky because fraudsters lie. So they will lie in their declaration. The third was the speed of decision. So 24 hours for a decision. Many fraud checks aren't done in 24 hours. They're done overnight and they're done in other ways. So that speed of decision increased the risk of fraud. And then I would say that the final fact is probably the speed of deployment, because some of those risks you may be able to manage if we weren't in a circumstance where we had to act very quickly as a government to support businesses. If this was more something we'd do in 6 months' time, you may be able to manage some of those risks by building systems to do data analytics and matching data and things to check self-declarations and to check other pieces. So I'd say that those 4 factors are what made it risky.
Just looking at that document, the paragraph 5 observes that the scheme's overseen by the British Business Bank. BEIS is the accountable department, but it was designed by HMT. That's an observation. Is that an observation as to why there was a risk of fraud, or is that just an observation as to how it was administered as a matter of fact?
Is it okay if I expand on this a
Yes,
little
of course.
bit? Thank you. So it's an observation, not of why the scheme is risky, but why it's difficult to deal with risk in the scheme. So there is a long delivery chain. And if I was looking at that delivery chain even more widely, actually the lenders are delivering it, and they're not mentioned in that. And then you have UK Finance as their representative body in that delivery chain as well. There are other factors which make it difficult to deal with fraud in the scheme, which I can touch on if helpful.
Just like you to expand on that delivery chain, so I'm sure we understand what you mean. Yeah. That the more people who are in the chain of delivery, the harder it is to get action on fraud.
Yes, the less quickly you can act, because there's more stakeholders you have to agree with and consult and get on side to do something. Yeah.
Okay.
I would just make another point, if that's
Of
if that's
course,
okay.
Mr.
I mean,
Cheeseman.
another factor in the system that makes it difficult to act on is a practical one, which is it is a system of lots of smaller loans. I've gone back to the point of you have to spend money to deal with fraud. When there's a high volume of smaller interactions or more small interactions, that brings additional challenges.
Okay. The view was taken there was an imperative, a need to stand the scheme up quickly, nonetheless, and it had to have those factors in order for it to save businesses that needed money. What was your function then in terms of supporting BEIS and the British Business Bank? What measures did you suggest could be put in place?
So our function was then to work to try and reduce the risk of the loss that was then in the system. And our sole focus was that. Other partners had a lot of other focuses as well, which should be borne in mind. And I think Richard Bierman touched on that yesterday in his evidence. So our focus was to how to understand the level of loss and to act on it. That's what we focused on.
And did you identify measures that could be put in place once the scheme was established that would not defeat the object of delivering money quickly, but would do what you could in the circumstances to mitigate the risk?
Yes, and we implemented a range of measures with the partners. We supported them in the duplicates check, although that was the CIFAS duplicates check, which was a check to see if loans had gone into different, an individual had taken out loans from different lenders and multiple loans.
We heard about that from Mr. Bierman yesterday.
Yeah.
He explained why it took about a month to set that up, because you were dealing with lots and lots of different lenders. Everybody had to buy in. You had to get the same data points and so on and so forth. But you think that was a good move taken by the bank?
It was a good move to do it, yeah. And we were involved in it.
Yeah.
And then we worked with the bank and other partners to implement a range of other controls over time.
And these were things like looking for change of director,
Yes.
and adding that flag to the CIFAS check, is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Checking on dates of incorporation of businesses,
Yep.
just to see if they'd been stood up just in order to make an application.
Yes.
And then was there something called a bounce back loan scheme verification service?
So we tried various things to try and deal with one of the fraud risks in the system, or one of the frauds in the system, I should say, which was inflating your turnover to get a higher loan. So the amount of loan you got was dependent on your turnover. We tried a range of pilots to try and do that, and eventually, I mentioned HMRC were helpful earlier. We set up something called the Turnover Verification Service, which was similar to what banks use to check mortgage applications and things like that, where the lenders could then check with HMRC on turnover, although that wasn't highly used.
Right. And then also something called the dissolution objections process. Can you just explain what that was and how that was this about preventing fraud or about assisting recovery of money?
Both.
Or both.
So a company may dissolve but still have a bounce back loan debt. And this was to put in a check so that debt could be realised. Now, some of those companies would be dissolving and have a bounce back loan debt and not have committed fraud, and that would just be part of it. But some may do. So in casting that net, you both reduce loss and increase debt recovery in the system, and that led to £243 million more coming back in. But you also make it harder for fraudsters to dissolve their company and take the assets.
So these were things that you were able to advise on and assist with, some things that the bank, British Business Bank, was doing proactively, other things that you were assisting them with.
Yes.
What was your assessment with the pace at which things were being done, whether enough was being done soon enough to bring in these sorts of checks?
So I think you can see from my evidence I was frustrated with the pace and I was encouraging urgency. At the time I felt like more could be done quicker.
Yeah. Just want to pick up on an email, I think, from you from the 14th of September 2020. If we could have INQ 000625905 and page 2, please. And now, this is a correspondence between David Raw at the Treasury and yourself, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And if we just see the second paragraph on page 2, I know this is fast moving, is how it begins. Mm-hmm. Highly political area, and we're all aiming for the same thing. As a bit of context from where I sit, this is the scheme that worries me the most of the C19 response, and that is something we cannot shy away from. And you've set out in BBL as of this week, there are over 9,680 suspicious activity reports raised by the banks, none of which we've been able to progress. 8 people have been stopped at the border with cash from the scheme, looking to take it out of the country. I feel we need a strong response in this area, and we will receive justified criticism if we do not. My view is we currently do not have a strong response. Now, accepting there is a need to stand the thing up quickly, if we work from that basis, and we've heard evidence about that, this is September of 2020. What did you think was lacking from the response in September 2020, bearing in mind that there was an imperative not to put in place things that would slow down the delivery of money to businesses who desperately needed it?
So my feel at the time was number one, what capability there was in the system to deal with this, but also how quickly we could put in some of the controls we talked about earlier, some of which were put in up front, right? They were put into the CIFAS portal for things for lenders to use. So my frustration, as you can see here, was around, I felt that more could be done, and we could look more at how we could go after some of the fraud in the system.
Okay. And on the 15th of September 2020, you wrote to the BEIS finance director to encourage BEIS to increase its investments in counter-fraud arrangements as part of the upcoming spending review. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
We could have up, please, INQ 000547796. And you say there at this first paragraph, I wanted to reach out to you as we build into the spending review. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Centre of the Counter-Fraud function has been quite intensely supporting BEIS through COVID-19, both in the business grants and the various loans to business. Most significantly, bounce back loans. You then talk about, in the third paragraph, funding that runs out at the end of 2021. And you say, from my perspective as the lead for the government's counter-fraud function, C19 has highlighted the limitations of BEIS counter-fraud capacity and capability, something that has not been needed so urgently before. And in fairness, you then go on to contrast HMRC and DWP. So you're not being critical of the will of BEIS there, it seems. You're commenting on the fact that they just didn't have the capability previously. Was that the biggest problem?
It made it more difficult for them to react to this grown risk. They did not have that capability there that was able to act. Yeah, and I was encouraging them in this email to set up, to look at the spending review and think about what their level of capability should be.
Yeah. And then you say in the next paragraph, my strong encouragement is for BEIS spending review bid to include a significant uplift in the department's counter-fraud capability. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I was quite strong in advice that I thought they should build their capability.
And how did you find that your urging to do that landed?
Well, I mean, so I think from the evidence we can see it takes time for that to happen. So the BEIS team increased to 10 by January, I think 2021 or 22. But the initial response was, I think the department, I can't really speak for the department, but I didn't get a response that, yes, we shall build this capability. That took a while for us to agree how we build things.
Looking at the position now in your current role, have things improved?
BEIS have a larger, it's Department for Business and Trade now, have a larger counter-fraud function now. In my role, I'd always be looking at how it can go further and how it can do more, but they have a larger counter-fraud function now, yeah.
But that's you performing your function of providing that external challenge. What more can you do?
Yeah.
But if we looked at capability 2020 compared to capability now, there have been improvements.
It has improved, yes.
Yeah. Can I just pick up one other discrete area? We've heard evidence that the British Business Bank contracted PwC to undertake some fraud sampling. We heard something of that yesterday from the bank's witnesses. But is it right that you were somewhat critical of their decision to commission that from PwC, not because they went to PwC, but because of how they were doing the analysis?
Yeah, so I think it says in my evidence. So the context I'd give to this is that fraud measurement is still a relatively new thing. So the government standards for it haven't been around for long. But when they were looking at doing fraud measurement in what I considered the highest risk area, you'll see from my evidence that our challenge to them, and my challenge to them direct, was that I felt that the testing was too shallow. So it didn't go into the depth that, for instance, HMRC or Department for Work and Pensions would do when they do their testing. So I challenged them on how much deeper they could go in looking for those risks. And that plays out in the measurement itself. So they take that forward. I think it's called Project Hastings. They take it forward. They do the sampling work to look for fraud in the system. When it comes to the end of post-event assurance, it does not pass the quality assessment done by the independent panel that looks at that. And their view on it was that some of the risks weren't covered and that it was reliant on the lender's tests rather than another piece of assurance done on that. So my advice early was around the method you use for doing fraud measurement, which is really understanding the risks and then testing, being really clear on which of those risks you're testing and testing as many of the high-risk ones as you can.
And just practically, can you just expand on that a little, what it actually looks like? Do you mean, dip sampling some particular cases and really driving down deep into those cases, or?
Yeah, so fraud measurement is distinct to audit. In audit, you might, and there are lots of different types of audit, but you might look and see if a control is in place or if it's acted. In fraud measurement, what you do is you take a case and you act as if you've had an anonymous tip-off that fraud has happened, and then you look for the evidence that might support that that's happened. And that's the way you test it. And you do that based off your knowledge of all the fraud risks and all the ways that fraud could be committed.
Yeah. So you're not taking cases because there actually has been such a tip-off. You're taking them as a random sample and saying, let's proceed on the basis that someone said this is a fraudulent claim. Let's drill down into it and see what we can find.
That's correct.
Okay. And do you think your concern was taken on board in terms of sampling?
I felt I was listened to. The sampling, as you can see from the and I'm sure it was tweaked a bit. It did not change to the extent that it met the independent assurance by the panel.
Given the time we've got left, I'm very keen that we look at lessons learned and potential recommendations for any future emergency. So let's look at some of the things you've found across the whole piece, so not focusing on individual schemes, but across government, and pick up on where you identified problems and what, if anything, has changed. First, as the precursor to the PSFA, did you find that there were limited levers that you had to compel or to engage with other public bodies and to encourage them to act?
Yes, and I felt there were limited levers, and there was, as you saw through the evidence, there was a debate in the system as to whether that was the role to encourage others to act. And the Public Sector Fraud Authority mandate now makes that a very explicit role of our organisation.
Yeah. So at the time, this was newly emerging, and there was, as you said, this sort of suspicion and this concern about where you sat as against the accounting officer responsibility, but that's changed.
I'd say it's clearer. There will always be a debate, but there is less debate.
Yeah. Generally, do you think that as the PSFA, there are sufficient legislative powers that you have as an organisation to tackle fraud across government?
So the government's just introduced a new set of powers from direct learning from the pandemic, and in fact, you can see in the evidence was part of what the Fraud Ministerial Board was looking at and we were looking at the time, the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Act, as it is now. That deals with one of the challenges from the pandemic, which was how do you investigate fraud outside of those big organisations like Department for Work and Pensions and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, where they have a lot of powers. So I feel those powers are in place now. We also have powers like the Digital Economy Act, which we had at the time, which enable us to share data. I think it will be a constant evolution as government explores how it best uses data. And we may find in the future there are more powers that may enable us to go even further on that could be considered.
So how important is the sharing of data across government for tackling fraud in schemes?
Very much so. So we've talked about intelligence, but the sharing of intelligence is helpful. And one of the good things haven't touched on in the pandemic was we didn't just share with government bodies, we also shared internationally and got some intelligence from them about what was going on. But also data is incredibly valuable because actually a piece of data held by Department X may be able to confirm or deny an application or a piece of data held by Department Y. So being able to share that data to understand whether those are in conflict or complementary is incredibly important.
But it's presumably then not just having the data, it's having the analytical capability to interpret the data in a way that would show up those difficulties?
Absolutely, and the capability to follow up. Because however good your data analytics and your comparisons are, there will always be some false positives. Yeah. And that was part of the nervousness on some of the analytics during the pandemic was false positives. So you need the capability to be able to work through those false positives as well.
If the data sharing is better and there are new legislation that enables that, where does the cross-government analytical capabilities sit at the moment?
With us in the Public Sector Fraud Authority.
Yeah. And do you consider that's the right place for it to be and that it is sufficient for you to be able to discharge your functions?
Yeah, I think it should sit somewhere that works across the whole of government and has a acknowledged remit for working with public bodies and an expectation that public bodies will work with it to provide and use the data and resources it has, yes.
In 2020, the pandemic crisis was a novelty. We'd never been in that position before. And we've spoken about the need for speed of delivery. But in a future emergency, how do you ensure that fraud controls are embedded in resilience planning and exercises that might be run?
First of all, I think we've done some of it. So the government has changed managing public money and the Green Book to incorporate something called an initial fraud impact assessment. The challenge with fraud risk assessment is that it can take time to do because it's quite a detailed piece. An initial fraud impact assessment is a quick, what's the likely level of risk? So changing managing public money to have the expectation that exists enables us to deal with it better in the future, but also changing it so fraud risk assessments are done up front enables it to be better in the future as well. The other thing that's we've been doing and that will help is that we've been increasing that work on fraud control in the profession. So when we came to the pandemic, what we really needed at the start was not lots of investigators, it was lots of people who understood risk, data analytics, how to build processes. So the government has been building training and qualifications to train people to have that capability in the system to use those tools.
Your organisation, the organisation you lead, has a mission statement, a purpose to prevent or minimise fraud in the public sector. But if you're a government department, how do you incentivise a government department to find fraud and to root it out and prevent it? Might be said that there'll be a perverse incentive not to look, because you don't want to reveal that you had lax systems or that there were gaps in something you launched. But what are you doing to incentivise departments, or how can departments be incentivised to think about fraud proactively?
So I would say the things we're doing to do it and how you can do it is, number one, is you try and create a culture where finding fraud is a good thing, which can feel counterintuitive, as I touched on before. I think the second thing you do, and we're doing, is you build capability across the system. If you have capable people who are able to make a difference, they will make a difference. They will find that fraud. They will help reduce it. So you don't just build it in the Public Sector Fraud Authority, you build it in the departments. You build it across that whole system. The third thing that we do, and as I said, it's recognised, we had that tension in the pandemic. Were we there to challenge? Is the Public Sector Fraud Authority has a role in holding public bodies to account. So do they have the functional standards in place? Do they have a target? So we've moved to a system from learnings from the pandemic that government departments have financial targets for their impact. That drives them, I said about the culture change, that drives them to look for fraud because they need to find it to have a financial impact on it. So it drives them to look for fraud, but it also encourages them to do stuff to find fraud and have a measured difference.
Your work is across the public sector, but there is always an interface between the public and private sector. What work needs to be done or is being done to engage the private sector, professional bodies, representative bodies, and bring them into the anti-fraud work that you're leading?
So we engage with them quite a bit. We have some cross-sector advisory groups. When we created the Public Sector Fraud Authority, we recruited people from the private sector into the Public Sector Fraud Authority to try and build those cross-system interplays. You know, I attend conferences and aspects like that, as do members of the Public Sector Fraud Authority, to share. Some of our data analytics work that we do now is done for the private sector as well as part of the government's fraud strategy. So could we do more? Yes, we could always do more, and we should always be looking at how we do more. But we're doing quite a lot to share between our sectors.
So do you think that, generally speaking, you bring in that external advice and expertise as and when it's required from those regulatory bodies, from professional bodies, and so on and so forth?
We look to. I mean, we've always got to challenge ourselves to do better. I'd say one of the challenges is that fraud roles are not always very tightly defined because everyone has worked it out differently how they work on it. So one organisation's compliance might be another organisation's fraud. One organisation's audit might be another organisation's fraud. So one of the things we have to do is make sure we're all talking the same language when we do that first of all.
Again, this might seem a bit counterintuitive. You might think, well, if you tell people we're looking for fraud, you're alerting fraudsters to the fact that there might be an opportunity here. So if you highlight a scheme and say, we're going to be keeping a close eye on applications, you're highlighting the problem. But how important is communication with the public, getting a message out there that you're bearing down on fraud? And do you think things have changed post-pandemic in that respect?
I think it has. I think we communicate a lot more about it. I think technically it's a complex area because, as you have pointed out, if you tell people about fraud, does that make them not do it or more aware they could? And you always need to be mindful of that. But I'd say on balance, the dangerous thing to do is to be quiet about it. Because if you don't talk about fraud, you then aren't countering what's going on, and you're not deterring in any way those who would commit it because they're not aware of the consequences or that people are looking or that more effort's going on. So there's lots of nuances to that debate, but I would say on balance, more is being communicated, and that is the right route.
Thank you. Mr. Cheeseman, those are my questions of you. Thank you very much. I don't think, my lady, there are any other questions of Mr. Cheeseman.
There aren't. Mr. Cheeseman, thank you very much indeed. It's been extremely interesting, helpful, and your evidence actually taken me back to my practice as a barrister. A number of things you said about fraudsters rang very true with me. Anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate it's been a really busy week for you, given Mr. Hayhoe's report. So I'm really grateful to you for all the help you've given in your written statement and, of course, this morning. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think that's time for a break now. Mr. Rice, is that correct?
It is, my lady. Thank you.
11:30. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Wright.
My lady, can I confirm again that you can see and hear us in the hearing room?
And thank you.
Thank you very much. Then I call, please, Lord Sharma.
I swear by the Gita
I swear by the Gita
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Just take a seat.
Thank you for coming back to help us again, Lord Sharma.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you for having me back.
Lord Sharma, you have provided a statement to the inquiry in this module. I'm going to give the reference for the record, which is INQ 000657978. And you give that statement in your capacity as the former Secretary of State at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy.
I do.
Thank you. Lord Sharma, I'm going to, first of all, under a very broad topic heading, explore with you the business loan schemes that your department was responsible for delivering. And within that broad umbrella, there'll be other subheadings, and I'll try and give you them as we go. But just so you know, that's where we're starting, because there are then other issues that later today we'll deal with. Can I first of all ask you, really just by way of overview, about where your department sat within the role of policy, design, delivery of those schemes? And I just want to summarise for you the evidence the inquiry's heard and see whether you accept it characterises the role of the department. As we understand the position, the overall policy decision was being made by the Chancellor of the Exchequer through the Treasury. Is that right?
Yes, on many of the schemes, the starting point, the framework of the policies were indeed put together by the Treasury.
Yeah. At the other end, in terms of loan schemes, the British Business Bank was doing the on-the-ground operational delivery of the schemes.
Yes, that is correct.
And your department, which was responsible for the British Business Bank, was sitting, if you like, between the Treasury and the bank, assisting the Treasury with the formulation of policy in a more granular sense, and also ensuring delivery of that policy. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. I think we were working on policy once it had been announced, to iterate it over a period of time. In certain cases, I think we perhaps had some more influence over some of the policies than others. And yes, of course, we formally had responsibility for the British Business Bank. So they were the people that I issued, or my permanent secretary would issue instructions to when they asked us to look at some of the policies in more detail and give our views to them.
Now, accepting that sort of scenario in which the Chancellor is setting the overall economic strategy, another department of central government is then involved in design and delivery, and an arm's length body operationally standing up the scheme is not unique. But looking at these schemes, the loan schemes. I just want to ask you for your views about those lines of responsibility and accountability from Chancellor through your department to the British Business Bank. And I do that picking up, which I know you're aware of, the report of one of the inquiry's experts, Dr. Tetlow, who describes those lines of accountability, in her opinion, as being slightly confused, and also pointing out that it led to the accounting officer being in your department, whereas overall policy was being set by the Treasury, a different department. And I just like your reflections on that, because you were there.
Yes,
did you find that led to any confusion in lines of accountability for the overall delivery of those schemes?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Wright, I think the first thing to say is that I had a good working relationship with the Chancellor, and I think, as you will have seen in both the oral evidence but also the written evidence from senior officials in both departments, they had a very collaborative working relationship. And one always has to be cognizant of the fact that ultimately the Treasury is the lead department for economic policy within the UK government, and actually also the lead department when it comes to emergency interventions. Having said that, as you said, there were policies that were being put together by the Treasury and decisions being made, which we weren't necessarily part of right from the start. I understand why. I mean, some of these policies were announced in conjunction with the budget on the 11th of March. And there is always, and even in peacetime, I can call it like that, a lot of sensitivity for market reasons around disclosing too much information out of the Treasury.
Lord Chairman, I don't want to cut him. Can I just ask you to slow down slightly? It's perfectly understandable. People speak.
You've come in early to give me that
well,
warning.
I just thought I'd get in early with it.
Absolutely.
Because I'll get a note in a moment telling me to tell you. So
fine. So the first reason that I'd understood, as I sort of pointed out, why these decisions were made within the Treasury is for confidential reasons within the budget. The second is that we had incredibly truncated timelines to make these decisions. So again, I appreciate why, on occasions, the Treasury went ahead and made those policy decisions and were brought in afterwards. My view is that it would have been helpful for the business department to be part of that policy making and decision making right from the start. And I say that not because I disagreed with the policies. I signed the direction letters. I was responsible, and I agreed with the policies. But I think it would have been helpful, one, as you point out, we were the policy making department, but secondly, from the practical aspect of implementation. If we had been aware of the precise details of where we were going in some of these policies, it might have allowed us to prepare a little bit better. And I'm sure we'll come and talk about grants, and that's a case in point where if we'd had a bit more information earlier on and been part of the decision making, perhaps our interactions with the local authorities would have been even more effective. In terms of this whole issue of where the accounting officer accountability lay, I've obviously seen and read the statement of Sir Charles Roxburgh, and he obviously gave evidence to you on Monday. I think he makes a very thoughtful point about whether in those circumstances at that time the accounting officer responsibility should have been split in terms of the Treasury taking responsibility for the policy and BEIS taking responsibility for the implementation.
Just pausing there.
Yes, of course.
Just to pick up, because you've mentioned Sir Charles's statement, and his evidence was, I think I can fairly summarise it as there wasn't a need for there isn't a need for an overall system of government change, for a long-term structural change, but given the circumstances, it might have been an idea if the accounting officer responsibility had temporarily shifted for that scheme. I think was where he landed in terms of his evidence to the inquiry.
Yes, and I know in his statement he also talked about the kind of the sympathy he had with his counterparts in my department in terms of the responsibility for the decisions. But I mean, frankly, even if that had happened, and I'll come on and address why I'm not entirely sure that going forward that's the right approach, but even if that had happened, the Chancellor, if he had been responsible for those direction letters, would have signed the direction letters. At least in this instance, my department, BEIS, had an opportunity to influence the policy iterations as they went forward. I think generally you want to try and keep the policy and the implementation with the same department. It's absolutely the case. The Treasury, being the responsible department overall, of course, will always have a say in these matters. And I think the way to kind of address this in the future is that we should have a sort of, if I can put it like this, a governance framework. And I'm not talking about a sort of 100-page document, Mr. Wright. I'm talking about a couple of pages of high-level principles about how different parts of government and different departments work together if we face an emergency in the future. And in that, I think one of the things that should be highlighted is that all the people who need to be round the table to make decisions should do that from the start. I think you can also look at, issues of highlighting that we should all be looking at how we treat vulnerable groups. And I think in this case, I know there were issues around the self-employed. And this is a document that first COBRA meeting that takes place to discuss the emergency, whoever is then the Prime Minister can make sure everybody understands this is the framework to which we work. And if we did that, these sort of tensions would not arise again. The responsible department for policy would be sitting alongside the Treasury when those decisions, early decisions, are being made.
Okay. Thank you very much for that considered answer and a full answer, which isn't a criticism at all, but it means there are a number of things I'd like to pick up from it and see if we can just investigate them a little further. Can I deal with the first or one issue? Which is this point about a lack of accountability to Parliament, because an accounting officer is responsible to Parliament. I understand what you mean, which is that whichever minister was ultimately responsible, so whichever department that responsibility sat in, the direction would have been signed. This was going to happen. So in terms of parliamentary accountability, should we understand your position is really that the idea that there was a lack of accountability is more theoretical than actual, because either way, a minister was going to be able to be responsible, held accountable by Parliament, and accounting officer would just be one department or another?
Yes, I mean, look, at the end of the day, in the case of these particular interventions, yes, I always sought to get the Chancellor's and formally as well the Treasury's agreement to proceed on each of these schemes. But kind of the buck stopped with me because I did sign those direction letters. I don't think that's the issue. What I'm trying to address is the practical aspects of how you ensure that in future there is joined up working so that the outcomes are improved in terms of the policy. The accounting issue, as I said, I think the two should sit together, the policy as well as the implementation.
Now, you also said that everything ideally should be kept together in one department. So I'm just going to pick up on that. I suppose the obvious question would be, well, which department? Which department should have responsibility in those sort of circumstances? Should it be the Treasury, which is, through the Chancellor, responsible for economic policy? Or should it be the Department of Business and Trade, as it now is, which has that peacetime, to use your phrase, responsibility for the British Business Bank? Which department would be better placed or doesn't it matter?
I don't think we should be looking to change the way we work in terms of these accountability lines, in an emergency situation. I think it's much better you work out up front now, before, God willing, we don't face another emergency, but you work those out now. As I said, I think the easiest way of dealing with this is not to change the framework of where accounting authority sits, but actually just in terms of practically how we work going forward in an emergency.
I suppose one of the big advantages in the Chancellor setting policy is that the Chancellor holds the chequebook. If another department was setting policy, that department would have to presumably formulate a policy, cost it, or predict its cost, and then go to the Treasury to see if the Treasury would fund it. So is it important, I mean, did it assist in terms of the speed at which government react that the Chancellor was taking this very hands-on approach and was setting the direction, because he could decide the policy and agree to fund it himself? He didn't have to have a conversation with himself.
Yeah, I want to be very clear about this, Mr. Wright, which is, I'm not suggesting that an individual government constructs policy by itself in the absence of the Treasury. The Treasury is the department overall responsible. There's no doubt about that. I worked well with the Chancellor, and actually, for the record, I would just say that I thought he did an admirable job in stewarding the economy during a very difficult time. What I'm saying is that in those instances where policy was being decided in terms of some of these interventions, by the Treasury, I think it would have been helpful to have BEIS sitting alongside. As I said, at the end of the day, the Treasury is the lead department, and they, as you said, they hold the purse strings. All I'm talking about is policy being made together. And again, this is not a sort of point of ego or anything like that. This is purely to make sure that when you then come to implementing, it makes it easier and faster and more effective to be able to do so.
No,
and by the way, that is how in peacetime policy is done. I mean, you iterate over weeks or months, and all departments are involved, and clearly the Treasury sort of takes a leading role. And I don't see why we want to try and continue in that frame, even in an emergency, but obviously in very truncated timelines.
And I think the point you were making is that had everybody been round the table together from the outset in the design of policy, you would have been bringing together those delivery experts at the policy design stage, which may have informed the design of policy before it was announced, and ensured that it actually was even more effective, deliverable, and ironed off those or knocked off rather those rough edges.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, we can do it sort of further on, or we can do it now, the whole sort of discussion on the grant schemes, the Small Business Grant Fund, for instance, where I know there have been issues, and I'm sure we'll discuss them, in terms of the interaction with the local authorities and the concern that perhaps they weren't involved right at the start in terms of design of policies. Now, that may have been challenging anyway in the truncated timelines that we had, but certainly we could have prepared more. We set up at the time a local authority advisory group of 20 local authorities in conjunction with discussions with the Local Government Association. Now, if we'd been able to do that a bit earlier and start to think about the guidance a bit earlier, perhaps we might have ensured a more efficient outcome at the end.
Yeah. Well, we will come back to those, but rest assured what you've said now is noted, and we won't waste time later repeating what you've said, but we will come back to local authorities as a more focused piece. But at this stage, I understand your position to be there isn't a need for significant system of government change here. What there is a need is for not a great volume, a tome that sits on the shelf, but a well-understood memorandum of understanding, essentially, between departments that this is how we'll work together, collaboratively, in a future emergency, with the usual caveats of budget confidentiality and so on. Those must remain.
Absolutely. And I just want to reiterate once again, so that there is no doubt at all, I agreed with all of these policy interventions. I sign the directions, and I'm sure we'll discuss these in a bit more detail on a case-by-case basis.
So can we move on to engagement with the Treasury as an institution? I mean, you mentioned that you had what you considered to be, and I'm sure from what we've read, was a very constructive working relationship with the Chancellor himself. The danger, I suppose, in relying on personal relationships is that they may not be the same as between departments, and personalities change. So, looking more on on an institutional basis at those relationships, I'd like to ask you about really engagement and the transparency of engagement that you encountered, your department encountered between yourselves and the Treasury, and in particular the sharing of analysis as between departments. And you've been asked to deal with this in your statement, and I'd like to pick up on it. You say at paragraph 11 of your statement that the Treasury may not have shared every aspect of its analyses on the economy. There have been good reasons why that would not have been a useful exercise. You didn't consider that to be a particular issue. How open and transparent did you yourself, your department, find the Treasury in terms of sharing its modelling and analysis?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right to raise as an institutional issue. I mean, I did have a good working relationship with the Chancellor. I think we're still on each other's Christmas card lists after all these years, so that probably means something. But from an institutional perspective, I think we overall had actually a pretty good working relationship with the Treasury. There were meetings relating to the economy that I would attend together with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, and they weren't necessarily, they weren't actually decision-making meetings. This was about sharing information in terms of what was going on in the economy, where we expected particular sectors to be experiencing difficulties. And so I personally didn't feel that there was any issue in terms of information sharing from the Treasury. And in fact, my own department was doing a lot of work as well, talking to sectors. I set up, I think the first of these meetings took place on the 11th of March, a group of representative business, representative organizations, around 19 of these, representing small businesses, large businesses, different sectors. And it was very important for me to have those conversations, and I did those twice a week. Actually, sometimes we may have done them more frequently.
I don't want to cut you off. I will come on to talk about that as an important development, an important initiative. But just.
So in summary terms, we were absolutely fine in terms of the information sharing with the Treasury when it came to analysis of what was going on in the economy. I had no concerns about that.
But I just want to pick up on a sort of wider cross-government point about analysis. As you said, your department was doing its own internal analysis, which was very important to informing you about what was going on in different sectors, in different areas of business. The Treasury was doing its own economic analysis. All departments will have been having their analysts running data. But one of the themes that has emerged in the evidence, in particular some of the evidence from the first week of this module, we heard from Rob Harrison, who ran the Directorate General of Analysis in the Cabinet Office, and he spoke about the need or the absence at the start of the pandemic of a sort of cross-cutting analytical function in government that could bring together all of that important work that departments were doing, like yours, and bring that together into a single document that provided a consensus voice of all of that analysis collated so that Cabinet could make decisions on that basis. Where does that, as a proposition, sit with you?
I think it's certainly an interesting proposition. I don't think, frankly speaking, we were lacking packs of information coming at us in terms of what was going in terms of the sort of the health of the nation, in terms of the business health of the nation. I don't think at any time I personally felt we were lacking that information to make the decisions. And there were groups of officials who would clearly sit together and I'm sure share information. I think it's worth considering the suggestion that's been made. The only thing that I would just say is that, in a really fast-moving environment, it may take you half a day to collate all this information, and you find that 24 hours later, it's somewhat out of date. So it's certainly worth considering, but if you were going to do this, you'd have to do this in a really efficient way and not produce a huge tome, but a few sort of effective sheets of information which allow, basically almost a sort of dashboard type document.
Well, that's effectively what Mr. Harrison spoke of, a snapshot that would provide in a page, this is the situation, this is the centralised analysis of where we are, this is our level of confidence in that prediction.
Look, I think it's worth exploring. I think we got a lot of this anyway in sort of, different sort of elements of the economy and the health of the nation. But I think it's worth exploring.
Yeah. And I just want to pick up again on something you've just said in part in answer to my last question. You acknowledge, I think, in your statement that there were times, you've already said it this morning, where a bit more notice would have been nice. It would have been nice to have known what the Treasury was going to announce before you heard it. But from your perspective, was that because the Treasury didn't want to tell you, or was it because the pace of events was such that there was not time for advance information being provided, consultation to take place? Things were happening, as you say, it was out of date a day later.
Yeah, I mean, I just repeat again, Mr. Wright, what I said earlier, which is I think the two key reasons was because some of these interventions were announced in conjunction with budgets, and there are confidentiality issues around that, and I understand and respect that. And the second, absolutely, as you say, it's because the timelines were so truncated that decisions were being made. What I have suggested to you and to the inquiry is how we might try and fix this in the future, but obviously that's for the inquiry to consider.
Yeah. I just want to give you an opportunity to comment on an observation of Gemma Peck, who was the Director of Business Growth in your department. I'm just going to ask that this is put up on the screen, so you just have a look at what she said in her statement. INQ 000657846. I hope it's page 12, paragraph 3.13. Yeah. We see there in that paragraph, I'll just read it into the record. There were occasions when developments within HMT progressed very rapidly, and we would receive notice of a decision, steer or request from the Chancellor that required an immediate response. This made it challenging for BEIS as the accountable delivery department for the schemes to backfill with proper processes of advising ministers and the accounting officer on the lengthier details of policy design and delivery. On some occasions, HMT and the Chancellor were, frankly, able to move at a faster pace on decisions, which the BEIS Secretary of State would have to play catch-up on. As the senior official responsible for ensuring ministers received quality advice and that the expectations on managing public money were adhered to, this could at times be frustrating. However, this was not driven by a lack of openness or transparency from HMT. It was because major decisions were being taken at pace by the Chancellor personally. So that's one of your officials saying she found it frustrating, but understandable given the pace. She describes you as, she thought, having to play catch-up. Did you feel like that you were having to play catch-up, or did you feel, as she concludes, that, yes, it was a bit frustrating, but this is just how it had to be?
So I guess it depends quite what's meant by sort of catch-up. I mean, I've explained to you how certain policies decisions were made, they were announced, we would get kind of 24 hours notice of them, and then help to iterate that policy and move forward with the implementation. So, I mean, if that is what Gemma means, then yes. I think just this point on frustration. I mean, I just want to make it very clear to the inquiry, my lady, that this particular point, which is that we were working literally round the clock, 7 days a week. I mean, I'm not just talking about the ministers, I'm talking about the officials as well. As well as responsibility for these interventions, obviously I was also had some responsibilities for vaccines, running the department in terms of all the other things we needed to do, as responsible for COP26 planning. So I don't think we had time, either as a collective body or as individuals, to sit there and get frustrated. Yeah, policies were announced, we got on with it and did the very best we could. But I just go back to the point I raised at the start of this discussion, which is that if we had been there right at the start, perhaps it might have been easier to implement these policies even more effectively.
And on that point about if you'd been there at the start, we shouldn't imagine, I think, that you're suggesting that you and the Chancellor were sitting around a table together working all this out. You're talking about at all levels of your departments that officials with particular areas of responsibility were working together across departments on these different schemes, different announcements that were coming. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, let me give you an example. Very soon after I came into post on the 13th of February, in fact, the next day I think we had a cabinet meeting, and I recall discussing the impact of supply chains freezing up on British manufacturing. And soon after, I asked my officials for what interventions we could make in terms of supporting businesses going forward. And the answer was that many of these would have to be macro interventions that were led by the Treasury, as they were. And there were two particular suggestions that I agreed with. One was on adapting EFG, the Enterprise Finance Guarantee Scheme. And the second was to look again at grants, because they had been used through local authorities when, for instance, businesses needed support because they'd suffered sort of flooding issues, as an example. I said I supported both of these. That was, I think, the 2nd of March. So this was sort of in the system, and I'm sure that my officials would have talked to the Treasury and said, yes, the Secretary of State is very supportive of this. I then found out formally on the 10th of March that EFG was indeed going to be iterated, and that became CBILS. And then it was announced by the Chancellor on the 11th of March. So all I'm saying is that I think I had no issues with the policy. It's absolutely the right policy to do that. All I'm saying is that if we had been part of that decision-making earlier, perhaps we could have done things faster in terms of implementation.
So in that example, you'd express the overall desire to utilise those sort of schemes on the 4th. You find out on the 10th it's going to happen. There's 6 days of time in which your officials could have been working collaboratively with the Treasury, not to therefore announce a perfect scheme on the 11th. Time probably still wouldn't have provided that, but at least one that you had been working together on and could have influenced.
Yes, I think doing some of the sort of background work, because everything takes time to get done, and as an institution, I think it doesn't matter whether you're a lending institution or a government department. Having more time to plan helps you in terms of better planning.
And you've spoken about the pressure everybody was under, which is obviously understood, and the pressure on people's time. But would it also be the case that if you'd been working collaboratively, there wouldn't have been the risk of work being duplicated? So your department and the Treasury doing similar but slightly different work in the same space, you could have just been working together and therefore avoiding a duplication of work and thinking.
Well, I mean, actually, I just slightly push back on that, Mr. Wright. I mean, we were working collaboratively overall, so I don't think there's any sense that somehow the Business Department and the Treasury at official level or ministerial level weren't working together. We were, and actually we came together actually very well when it came to iterating policy. I just go back to my sort of central point, which is that if you want to get better outcomes in terms of implementation of policy, then actually the department that is to do with the implementation should probably be there at the start of the policy decision-making process.
Now, can I move on then from those sort of structural points that we've been discussing and talk about what I will term the initial response? I'm talking here about the early days, really. February, March, that initial response of government. You had become Secretary of State, I think, on the 13th of February.
Yes.
I won't ask if it was a Friday, but anyway, it was on the 13th of February.
I think it probably was a Monday.
Yeah.
The next day was a Tuesday, and a cabinet meeting took place.
But I think the Chancellor had been appointed himself on that day. And as you say, you attended Cabinet on the 14th of February, and you provided a briefing, I think, to Cabinet that from the perspective of your department, coronavirus was already spreading in terms of its impact on industrial companies beyond China. Such was the global supply chain that might now appear obvious, but for example, components from China that were necessary in manufacturing were not becoming available. So there was already, on that date, global supply chain disruption being picked up. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And I gave that. I haven't seen the subsequent minutes of Cabinet and how it was recorded, but I did make that particular point. And I have to say, I think in terms of my briefings for all of these cross-ministerial meetings, I think my department prepared me extremely well.
Yeah. And I'd just like to put up on the screen a paragraph from your statement, because I would like to ask you some questions about it. It's paragraph 9, page 5. Yeah, and about halfway through, there's a sentence, as I set out in this statement.
Yes.
As I set out in this statement, there were many acute warnings from business representative organisations and individual corporates about the very survival of many UK businesses without urgent support from the government. This was around a time where the projections of the Office for Budget Responsibility included estimates that GDP would fall by 35% in the second quarter of 2020. Set against that background, when considering the costs associated with taking action to introduce a scheme, ministers also had to consider the cost of inaction. And I just have set that out there because we're going to look at the early stages of the response. And I just want to understand and give you an opportunity to speak to that point you're making there about, yes, there was a cost of action. And now, presumably by cost of action, you mean the pure fiscal cost, how much government money would be required. But also, are you including in that costs like risks of fraud, risks of error, delivery risks, all of those sort of risks?
Yes, I'm talking about the total cost to the government as a result of the interventions. And just this point on GDP, that figure of 35% actually, I think, came from a coronavirus a report that the OBR put together on, I think it was published on the 16th of April.
Yes, this is a little later.
This is a little later.
Trying to set
yes,
the background to the decision.
Absolutely. But I just want to put this in context.
Yes, of course.
So, in 2019, the GDP, the size of the British economy, was around £2.21 trillion. 35% drop would have been around 750 billion plus. in the end, the outcome, even after the interventions, Mr. Wright, the British economy fell by 20%, just under 20% in terms of the size of it in Q2 2020. Now, that was pretty bad news for very many businesses, but I would contend is that because of the interventions that we made, that delta of 330 billion between 20% and 35% was avoided in terms of drop in the economy in Q2 2020 precisely because of the interventions. And that is the point that I wanted to highlight here. The cost of inaction would have been hundreds of billions of pounds to the British economy. And it's not just about numbers. This is about individuals' livelihoods. It's about people running businesses. And frankly, the interventions, they weren't perfect, and we can discuss how we could have improved them. But if we hadn't made these interventions, we would have been in a far worse position coming out of COVID than we did.
Yeah. I think Sir Charles Roxburgh made this point when he gave evidence that he encouraged people to think about the impact of what the government did in terms of jobs, the economy. And is that really the point you're making?
That, Mr. Wright, is absolutely the point I'm making. So I think some of the analysis post, obviously, these years shows that across all of the schemes that we were effectively responsible for in BEIS, 1 million jobs were saved. The benefit to cost analysis also showed, it was done by the BBB, and I think it's in the EP pack that has been shown to me, was positive. I think if you take them all into account, something like 1.27, range 1.27 to almost 4. Tens of billions of pounds added in terms of gross value added because of the interventions that were made. But, ultimately, this is also about, avoiding the human cost of people losing their jobs and their businesses.
And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to set that context, because it does frame your evidence in your statement when we look at the early response and also when we look at schemes, which is why I've dealt with that at that stage. But going back to the early days and that briefing you gave to Cabinet about global supply chains and disruption there, would it be fair to say from that from your perspective, from your department's perspective, you understood from an early stage that unlike in a financial crisis we might see in a recession, where there would be a demand side drop in the economy, that there was here an obvious supply side shock to the economy coming?
Yes, absolutely. I understood that. In fact, I remember soon after my appointment, it may have been towards the end of February, it may have been actually just before the budget on the 11th of March, I can't remember now precisely, but I went in to see the Chancellor and some of his officials, including Sir Charles Roxburgh, and I do recall at the time saying something along the lines of, this is going to require interventions of tens of billions of pounds. Now, I was wrong in the scale because we went into hundreds of billions of pounds, but I think there was no doubt in my mind that we needed to have, the right level of intervention in terms of a mindset. And I also recall sort of middle of March, as we realized things were getting significantly worse, actually having a message exchange with the Prime Minister's then Chief of Staff, Dominic Cummings. And I said to him, we need to make sure that we do big interventions. We can't do piecemeal. And I think he sort of sent a message back to say he agreed with that. And so certainly on a personal level, but also as a department, we were very clear that we needed to be bold in terms of the interventions that we were making.
And just picking up on that, the 2nd of March, if that's the date you think you had that conversation. In fact, the inquiry understands on the 2nd of March you attended a COBRA meeting when you were pushing for business support options to be accelerated and pushing for the Treasury to engage with and fund those sort of options. And also we understand that on that date there was a submission to you setting out options for government intervention, because you were already seeing or understanding that there would be liquidity problems with firms if there was a worst case scenario, and you were already looking then at things like working up the EFG, developing that. So it seems that from your department's perspective, from an early stage, from almost that first cabinet meeting on the 14th, you can see this global supply chain disruption. You can see the supply side shock to the economy that's coming, pushing for developments. Did you feel between the date of your appointment, you've hit the ground running, to the 2nd of March, that those warnings were being heeded, that it was being taken seriously enough across government in terms of this economic response that was going to be required?
Well, I think in all of these cases, many of us were facing an unprecedented situation which we had never faced before. And I think, I suspect in the early stages, collectively as a government, we probably didn't move as fast as we should have done. But actually, very quickly, as the evidence came to light that this was a really very, very bad situation on a human level, but obviously on an economic level as well, I think things accelerated pretty fast. And I go back to this point about the Chancellor. I think he did realise actually that we needed to make some bold interventions, and that's again what led to some of the schemes that we were discussing.
Mr. Charles Roxburgh made the point that the budget as a standard fiscal event was set for the 9th of March, I think.
11th
of March, forgive me. That was always going to be the budget date. It was nothing to do with the crisis. Therefore, whatever was going to be announced was going to be announced at the budget on the 11th of March. And so Sir Charles, I think, shared your view that, yes, there could have been a few days of keener action, but it wouldn't have actually changed the timing of the initial announcement, nor would it have foreseen how quickly that announcement would become out of date.
Yes, and so I think you made this point. I was appointed on the 13th of February. The Chancellor was also appointed on the 13th of February. So we were new to post. He'd obviously served as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, so was familiar with the Treasury and how it worked. But I think in all of these things, it does take time. And, it was, in terms of sort of working days, we're talking sort of, 15, maybe 20 working days between our appointments and the budget. And I think the Treasury actually did, in the end, move pretty fast. And I think many people considered what was announced at the budget to be an impressive package of measures. But again, as you say, what became very clear, particularly in my discussions with the business representative organizations, is that they saw that as a starting point. And I think I say that in my statement and cite some of the bodies that made that point. They saw that as a starting point, and they were very clear that we needed to get further interventions, bigger interventions in place to support businesses.
Well, let's move on to those business representative organisations with which you engaged, because that's a helpful point at which to look at it. I think on the 11th of March, you chaired a meeting with, so this is the day of the budget, you chaired a meeting with business representative organisations together with two other ministers, Nadhim Zahawi and Paul Scully. And as you say, that's where the CBI was saying to you, good start, but we don't see this as the final suite of measures that we're going to need. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And I think that was the sense of that whole meeting. I'd actually asked for this group to come together sort of earlier in March, and it was sort of planned. And then obviously the first meeting was on the 11th of March. But it goes back to an earlier point you were making, Mr. Wright, about getting everyone in the room together so we have a sort of shared set of information that we're working towards. And for me, these business representative organizations were incredibly valuable in telling us what was going on the ground in their sectors. And telling us on a repeated basis that businesses were likely, particularly small businesses, were likely to run out of money within weeks and in some cases days. And that's why getting cash to them as soon as possible was so important.
Yeah. And I think on the 12th of March, so you had your first meeting on the 11th, you met again on the 12th. And I think on the 12th, the Federation of Small Business were describing exactly that to you, that they were facing very real and severe cash flow problems.
Absolutely. And it's not surprising because obviously, as you said, there was a big supply side issue. We knew going into the pandemic that actually only 22%, I think this statistic is correct, only 22% of small businesses had a cash balance of more than £10,000. So that's almost 80% of small businesses with a cash balance of less than £10,000. And that also explains to you the interventions we made, the size of the interventions we made, and the speed at which we made them.
Yeah. So you were getting very good intelligence, real-time information from these organisations, gathering that on the 11th and 12th. I just want to, sorry if this feels like we're going back to an issue, but I'd just like to know how this worked. You're getting that information. How were you able to plumb that into number 11, to the Treasury, in terms of assisting them to formulate policy? Because what you've said about the Federation of Small Business, for example, might indicate the need to introduce loan schemes.
Yeah. So I think the Treasury obviously was having similar conversations as well. I can't tell you whether there was a similar format or not, but I'm pretty confident that the Chancellor and his ministers would have been having similar conversations. And I also think, and I can't now tell you sort of precisely the mechanism, but I'm pretty sure what was being said to the business department was being shared in some format with the Treasury by our officials.
Yeah. You described these meetings as, your words, a rich source of intelligence and one that you would urge would be deployed in a future response. I just want to pick up on that in a forward-looking sense. Do you think there needs to be any formality about that, or is the formality the enemy of just getting the right people in the room? In other words, if you have a standing panel of people, they might not actually be the people you need in the next crisis. So is it just something that should be noted in corporate memory of the Department of Business and Trade, or can it be more formalised?
No, so I think one of the recommendations that I've made in my statement is precisely about having a standing panel to consist of, current civil servants, ministers, but actually also former civil servants who were kind of there at the time, and indeed former ministers. I think they should make themselves available for this kind of endeavour, and also the business representative organisations. And for this standing panel to perhaps meet on a quarterly basis, to keep updated all the potential interventions, but also actually to have a look and see what is going on in the world right now in terms of interventions being made by other countries, and whether that could be pulled into a suite. I think there would be a real value in having this standing panel which meets on a regular basis. And that's, of course, in addition to, I'm sure, that the current Department for Business is having sort of conversations, I suspect, on a daily basis with business representative organizations. What I'm talking about in terms of standing panel in this case is one that is focused on how do you deal with a future emergency.
Yeah. So looking at preparedness for the next emergency, and by the sound of it, doing two things really. First is continually reviewing playbooks, schemes, checking that they remain fit for purpose, checking they remain operationally viable, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, and that I think is consistent with the recommendations you're getting from actually a number of the key players who were involved at the time.
But also providing, through that panel, real-time intelligence, both as to the state of the economy, which is always helpful to have, I assume, as a Department of Business, but also looking around the world and seeing, well, if there's an emergency going on with flooding in one country or another sort of crisis elsewhere, what is that government doing? How are they standing up support? Are there lessons we could learn?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I just want to pick up upon a point you made about, I think, sort of corporate memory. I think we all hope that we do not face any kind of emergency like this in the future. But there may be one. We don't know whether it'll be the next few years or, in a decade or so. But that's why I think this kind of panel is so important in terms of having people on it who were there at the time to advise the panel, but actually to also put themselves forward and available to a future government and a future set of ministers who face those same challenges. I actually think during the COVID period, I certainly worked very collaboratively with Ed Miliband, who was my opposite number at the time. And I think that's the spirit in which all politicians should approach this, especially in regard to planning for any future emergency.
Right. Thank you very much. Can we move on then to another significant topic, and that is the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, CBILS. And I just want to set out a bit of the context, and then we'll get into the topics. So this was announced by the Chancellor on the 11th of March when he announced that the EFG, that's that pre-existing framework that the British Business Bank operated, would be amended. It opened to applications on the 23rd of March, so 12 days later. And it closed to applications on the 31st of March 2021. I'm including under that time window the original end date and that it was extended.
Indeed.
But
Yes,
we'll pick that up as we work through it. That's
Sure.
when it closed. And the inquiry understands, by way of brief overview, that this was offering loans to small and medium-sized businesses of up to £5 million, backed by a government guarantee of 80% of the loan value. And to be eligible for this support, a business had to self-certify it was adversely affected by the pandemic. And there had to be a borrowing proposal demonstrating essentially that, but for the pandemic, this was a viable objective. And your department, in its corporate statement, provides this as the objective. I'll just read it out and you can confirm whether you agree with it. The policy objective of this loan scheme was to stimulate the provision of debt finance to businesses in the UK that were otherwise viable. The government guaranteed the lending, with some of the risk of defaulting on the loans being transferred from lenders to the government. So this is stimulating the market, providing that. Is that a fair summary of the scheme?
Yes, I think that's a very, very fair summary, yes.
And we know that the scheme was a collaborative effort between your department, the Treasury, and the British Business Bank, and we've looked at how you interacted together, Treasury setting overall economic policy, Bank delivering, and you in the middle. Now, so far as the Enterprise Finance Guarantee Scheme was concerned, was it in fact a scheme that had been stress tested back in 2019 and you'd been looking already at how it might be capable of being worked up in the event of what was described as a disorderly Brexit?
Obviously, I was not in post in 2019, so I don't know precisely what was done. But the reason that this scheme was used is because lenders were familiar with it. It was one we could take off the shelf and we could iterate, and that, frankly, just saved time.
Okay. So there was the big advantage that you had the architecture in place, the core structures in place. It could be taken off the shelf. But CBILS was not a simple extension of the EFG, was it?
No, it wasn't. I think the volumes were obviously larger than was anticipated under EFG.
Yeah. So there's volume of applicants were going to be larger. but also they were more generous terms
Yes.
with the government guarantee and a broader category of eligible applicants. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And so all of that, I suppose, would inevitably lead to there being higher volumes because you're
Yes.
expanding the pool of people who can apply
Absolutely.
and making it more attractive. Now, looking at the existing architecture and why it was decided to use that, was one of the advantages that you considered that you already had a panel of accredited lenders. And we'll go on to look at how that was expanded, but the lenders were already in place, or at least the opening set of lenders were in place.
Yes, I think the opening set of lenders was in place, but I think it's even more fundamental than that. It is that this was a scheme that was understood by the banking ecosystem, if I can put it like that. If we'd started from scratch, I would say it would have taken us much longer to actually get going and get a scheme put in place. And one could sort of think about whether, if we hadn't started with the EFG, could we have started with a perfect scheme? I don't believe so. I think there would have been delays. And even with this newly designed scheme, we would have had to iterate it as we did with CBILS. So I think it was a very good starting point. And frankly, Mr. Wright, is one of the reasons why so many of us who've given evidence as inquiry are suggesting that we have a worked up suite of interventions ready, which can be iterated, so we don't lose time at the start of a future emergency.
Yeah. And another advantage, I mean, this all goes to support that point, I'm sure. You've got a scheme, but that meant that you had an established IT system for it, that there were established operational systems, there were standardised documents, there were trained staff. I mean, these are all things that need to be thought about, aren't they, if they're going to stand up something totally new?
That's absolutely right, but I think all of that also had to be iterated. And I think in terms of staff, clearly the lenders did need to step up in terms of staffing and, frankly, the hours that the staff were working. And all of that takes time. If we had not had EFG, we would not have started with that, what I would regard as a very good base to actually plan the intervention from.
And notwithstanding that you had the basic architecture and you had therefore that head start, this was a different scheme, and therefore there was still going to be a need to test it operationally, particularly with the higher volume. And I think this chimes with really what you're saying, but I'm just going to give you an opportunity to comment on it. This is something Sir Charles Roxburgh said in his statement. He says, "My one regret in the areas for which I was responsible is that we in HMT, BEIS and the British Business Bank did not collectively do more to test the operational readiness and scalability of the Enterprise Finance Guarantee product." Now, he acknowledges there's a lot of hindsight in that. You didn't know what was coming. But I think the point he's making is that you've been now through a pandemic, and therefore you're in a position now to think ahead and to do operational testing that assumes much higher volume and a far greater panel of members. Is that really what you're suggesting in terms of your off-the-shelf schemes?
Yes, absolutely. That is absolutely right. And of course, Sir Charles is right. In an ideal world, you would have sort of tested volumes. But I mean, frankly, we didn't have time for that. Just the whole application process to get a loan through CBILS took a number of weeks. So the idea that we would have first spent a few weeks sort of, testing this thing, I don't think is realistic, but he is absolutely right, and I agree with the point that actually for future interventions we should be stress testing them ahead of time.
You've commented on, in a future emergency, it would have been ideal if your department was in the room and could have worked up policy. In those 12 days between announcement and the scheme being stood up, were there, or what was the ability of your department, did you think, to influence policy in terms of how it was actually going to operate?
I think we had a good opportunity to influence policy, and I think as iterations were made, they were put to me by my department. There was a sort of direct an open line with the Treasury on the interventions, and I think you spoke earlier about whether the Chancellor or I were sort of sitting in a room making policy. That isn't the way, particularly in a sort of emergency situation, it worked. I think it quite rightly worked through official channels to make sure that everything was documented and there were no misunderstandings. But I feel sort of comfortable that we did have an opportunity to influence the design of the policy once it had first been announced.
Yeah. On timing, we know the scheme went live on the 23rd of March, so 12 days after it was announced. I mean, that's a pretty tight timetable for a scheme of this size. And is this fair that the Chancellor was really driving that date of the 23rd of March?
Yes, I think that's fair, but I mean, frankly, I agreed with the Chancellor. I mean, we talk about 12 days, and I said to you, Mr. Wright, what happened, even with the interventions, with a 20% fall in GDP in Q2, I mean, every day we're talking about billions of pounds extra in terms of the economy going down. And so I think he was absolutely right to push for as quickly as possible to have this policy implemented.
One of the consequences, as we understand it, of that truncated from ordinary times delivery period is that your department, for example, had not completed its sort of value for money analysis at the time it went live. You were being told that it wasn't possible to have a reliable estimate of gross value added before launch date. But I just want to pick up on that. Those are things that normally happen in government. You would normally do your value for money analysis. You would normally have presumably an estimate of gross value added of a scheme. But you were receiving intelligence directly from business. And were you, to an extent, trusting what business was telling you in terms of the need to move quickly, rather than waiting for officials to do all the checks they would normally do in ordinary times?
No, I mean, anyone who's worked with me will know that I liked us to follow due process and for decisions to be based and made on evidence that's put forward. If we think about this particular instance with CBILS, I had to give a direction for that, actually, frankly, twice on different elements of the CBILS iteration. And the reason for this is because whilst my permanent secretaries at the time, and indeed in all future directions that I had to give, were very clear, they understood the impact on business and the severity on business. They were required to fulfill their obligations in terms of managing public money and ensuring that they could show value for money. And they weren't able to do that, and that is why I was required to give a direction. I think part of the reason, yes, there was time in terms of the analysis, but these were new interventions. And we know now, looking back, that actually they were all positive. Overall, they were all positive in terms of sort of benefit to cost ratios to the economy in terms of gross value added. But frankly, I didn't think that there was necessarily the data available at the time to be able to make those judgments. And so I completely understand why my permanent secretaries felt they couldn't make that judgment, and therefore they required me, as the Secretary of State, to give a direction. And yes, so that process was followed quite rightly, but at the same time, we were getting these daily messages from businesses that we had to act now because people were going to run out of money in days.
And does this then really go back to the point I identified in your statement earlier, that this was the trade-off of the risk of inaction? The risk of inaction was so great that you had to take these steps, even if in ordinary circumstances you'd have waited for these formalities to be completed?
So I think that you're right. There's the issue of trade-offs, and the key issue for me, and I was totally aligned with the Chancellor on this, was that in all of these interventions, we had to speed them up as much as possible. Now, that's not to say that we weren't cognizant of the risks that we faced. And I'm happy to discuss with you on these individual schemes what we did. But in summary terms, the conclusion was, yes, you can put in place some interventions to try and alleviate risk in terms of fraud, in terms of credit losses, but that is going to take you some weeks to do. We didn't have weeks. Businesses literally had their backs against the wall, and that's why we had to act.
And so if someone were to say, well, if you'd have taken another couple of weeks, you could have designed out some of the glitches in the scheme, you could have, for example, increased the maximum loan size as you had to do a few weeks later, or you could have removed the requirement for businesses to have been turned down first for commercial lending. How would you respond to that? You should have waited a couple of weeks to do that, to sort out all of those things.
I think we were in a really fast developing situation, which, frankly, none of us, actually, many of us had never faced before. We were doing the best we could. On the one hand, making sure that we were taking the right measures to safeguard public money, but on the other hand, always understanding that this was also first and foremost about saving the British economy. And so as we needed to iterate, we did. And I'm sure we'll talk about bounce back loans, Mr. Wright, but I just want to make one particular point on this, is that anyone who says, if only you had waited a week or two to make some interventions, then needs to understand what that would have meant. In the case of bounce back loans, some of those interventions, even with the experts working on them, came, a month or more later. We didn't have time to wait for a month. Those decisions had to be taken to save businesses and jobs, and that's what we did.
Yeah. And I just want to, before we take the break for lunch, and I'll deal with this fairly briefly, but it just completes this part of your evidence. On the 19th of March, we understand that the British Business Bank's Chief Executive Officer wrote to the Permanent Secretary, Alex Chisholm, updating him on the bank's role in delivering CBILS and setting out concerns about delivery. That Alex Chisholm, your Permanent Secretary, then requested from you on the 22nd of March a ministerial direction. Is that right?
That is right. I recall typing it up, sitting in my kitchen, I think on the night of the 22nd.
Well, let's just put that up. It's INQ 000064753, I think. There you are. 22nd of March. I've decided to issue a ministerial direction for the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. As you rightly highlight, in the current circumstances, there are a number of good reasons to justify the introduction of this scheme. Without the government intervening, there are very real risks faced by a large number of businesses in the UK. This would result in a large number of jobs being lost, which would have a significant long-term impact on the national economy. Then comment on speed. You believe the economic case for action was compelling. You then talk about state aid approval. That's related to the European Commission,
Yes,
is that
indeed.
right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we can go on to the next. And you were confident that you would get the consents you needed there.
Yes.
You're prepared to provide support for the introduction of the scheme. I'm formally directing you as accounting officer to take this forward with immediate effect. That was you gave that advice for the reasons you've just explained, that there just was not time to wait because these businesses were going to fail if you didn't do something.
That's absolutely right. And I think you've obviously seen written evidence, but also heard some of the oral evidence from at least one business representative organisation about just how dire the situation was for them, or certainly for their members. And I think this merely reflected that message that we were getting from the business community, and frankly that we could see with our own eyes in terms of what was happening in the economy.
Thank you very much. My lady, is that a convenient moment at which to take the break?
It is certainly. I shall return. I think I've got something I must do. I'll return at 10 to 2.